Upgrade your shit.
What's up, everyone? I'm Coach RT3 from the Upgrade Guys, and today we're going to just talk about the fundamental movements of the hip joint. Rotation is the fundamental movement of your femur in that joint. However, we have different directions at which, or linear pathways in which we commonly utilize as terms. So we have hip flexion, we have hip extension, we have adduction, and we have abduction. So adduction, abduction. And then we have internal, external rotation of the hip joint. So those movement pathways are the common ways in which we utilize to describe how the hip is moving. Now, I want to break down just a little bit further to help people understand, just in the sense of how we go through our cars. So first we'll start with that, and then we'll address some other issues as well when it comes to how the hip is rotating in the joint. So with our cars, for example, we first start out with coming into adduction. That's crossing the midline here. So adduct across the midline, we're trying to squeeze out adduction. Now, as we're adducting, we're also going to begin to externally rotate. So when we externally rotate, if you think of my hand or my forearm as the bone here, we're going to begin to rotate it this way. So as we rotate it this way, we're beginning to go into that hacky sack motion into external rotation. But this is also hip flexion, right? Because we're raising the leg up. So we're going into some degree of external rotation and hip flexion. As we get to the top, we're going to continue to go into more hip flexion here at the very top. Now we're going to go into abduction. So that's moving away from our midline. So we're going abduction, and we open up here, okay? Once you run out of room here, we begin to internally rotate. Okay, so our hip will internally rotate. I need to create more space here. Our hip will internally rotate, and then we go into extension as we move back, continuing in internal rotation, and we join the knees next to each other here. Now, our first movement from here is going to be extension. So we're moving the hip into extension. The hips have a very small degree of extension in actuality, so you won't be able to get most, but people still need to train that. So first extension. After we've gone into extension, we will go into abduction, which is bringing this bone away from the body again. So out. And then we begin to externally rotate that bone. But we're also going into flexion. So once again, it's external rotation and flexion. We begin to go into adduction. So you can remember that by adding to the midline. Adduction. And then we continue to externally rotate here as we squeeze out more adduction and return down to the bottom. Now, some important points here about the hip joint. The car gives us a good degree of exploration of our end ranges of the motion of the hip. However, we tend to train the hips in more linear pathways, but we shouldn't just be training our hips in exact linear pathways. Sometimes we need to train them in other ways. So if we think about hip flexion, for example, some people say, oh, okay, hip flexion, cool, straight up and down. But is this hip flexion? Yes. Is this hip flexion? Yes, right? All of those degrees are hip flexion. Abduction, moving away from the midline. We can go straight out, which you see people do that a lot with a band, going straight out. But is this not abduction as well? Is that not abduction? So we can go at angles as well. All right, so that's just something to think about as you start looking at how the hip functions and how the hip moves. And if you want to understand how to best look at the hip joint, you want to take the ball and socket and look at how the femur sits in there. Anytime we move, for example, so this is my hip, this is the ball of my femur. If I move into flexion here, the head of my femur is actually rotating. If I move into abduction, which is to move out, guess what the head of my femur is doing? Rotating. If I move into extension, the head of my femur is also rotating. So anytime I move into any of those directions, the head of my femur has to rotate. So the fundamental movement of the hip joint is to be able to rotate. And the more freer you're able to rotate, the better all of those other movements are going to be. Thanks for watching.
Upgrade your shit.